Imagine spending 2 years of your life with the label Chinese spy hanging over your head. Your face is in the papers, your career in ruins, accused under the Official Secrets Act. You're a former parliamentary researcher, and the state, with all its power, believes you betrayed the country. You're heading for dramatic trial. And then, one Monday morning, at London's most famous criminal court, it just stops. The prosecutor stands up and effectively says, "We've got nothing." The case doesn't just collapse, it evaporates. For one of the accused men, Christopher Cash, it's the end of a nightmare. He walks out of court a free man, finally able to breathe. But just as he takes that breath of relief, a political storm begins to brew just a couple of miles away in Downing Street. The Prime Minister's office calls the outcome extremely disappointing. Senior politicians insist the threat was real, that the links to Beijing were clear. So what just happened? How does a case this serious, built by counterterrorism police, simply vanish, leaving behind an acquitted man on one side and a furious government on the other? This isn't just about two men, it's about what happens when a spy story doesn't get its ending.
That's quite the scenario, isn't it? The whole state machinery just, grinding to a halt. A man walks free, government's furious. This deep dive is really all about pulling back the curtain on that vanishing act. We're going to explore the really complex legal challenges that make prosecuting these espionage cases so incredibly difficult here in the UK, even when, intelligence agencies have pretty strong suspicions.
Yeah, and we'll connect that sort of legal quagmire to the much larger geopolitical chess game. Specifically, we'll look at how this collapse ripples through UK-China relations. Especially given, the UK government's persistent warnings about foreign interference and, on the other side, Beijing's equally consistent denials.
It's a real tightrope walk, that relationship.
Absolutely. And it gets even trickier when big cases like this just fall apart in court. We'll also look at how this whole event is prompting a pretty critical reevaluation of security within the UK Parliament itself. It really shines a spotlight on potential vulnerabilities right in the heart of government. It's a complex tapestry, really. Law, intelligence, international relations all woven together. And we're here to help you sort of navigate through it, try and offer a clear path through all the intricate details.
Okay, let's unpack this vanishing act then. Let's dig into those legal foundations first. At the heart of it all, you've got the Official Secrets Act. But as we'll see pretty quickly, it's a piece of legislation that often feels, a bit outmatched by modern espionage. The central challenge, particularly with the Official Secrets Act from 1989, is what people call the damage dilemma. So this act makes it an offense for Crown servants or government contractors to disclose information without authorization, but, and this is the really crucial bit, only if that disclosure is actually deemed damaging to the interests of the state.
And that damage requirement, that's where the evidentiary hurdle becomes not just big, but honestly monumental. It leads to this sort of fundamental clash between state secrecy and, open justice.
Right.
The prosecution often finds itself in a classic catch-22. Picture this. To prove that a disclosure caused actual damage, they might have to reveal even more sensitive national security information right there in open court.
Which defeats the whole purpose.
Exactly. The very act of revealing more secrets to get a conviction totally undermines the main goal, which is protecting those secrets in the first place. It's just inherently counterproductive. It's not just some legal technicality. It's a major strategic vulnerability. Proving the threat risks exposing more secrets. It's a bind.
Completely. And look, this isn't actually a new problem. We've seen this play out before historically. It really shows the Act's limitations. Remember the Gunn case back in 2004?
The GCHQ translator.
That's the one. She worked for GCHQ, admitted leaking an email about spying on UN diplomats before the Iraq War. Big deal at the time. But despite her admission, the Attorney General just dropped the case. Reports suggested her defense would lean heavily on necessity. This common law idea where sometimes you have to do something illegal to prevent something worse.
Right, the greater good argument, essentially.
Exactly. She argued her actions were needed to prevent an illegal war. That case really shone a light on just how difficult it is to actually prosecute these things successfully under the current rules, especially when, defining damage or public interest gets messy and needs you to air sensitive stuff in public.
And you can go even further back.
Yeah.
Under the older 1911 Act, there was the Ponting case in 1985. He was a senior civil servant during the Falklands War.
Leaked documents about the sinking of the Belgrano, wasn't it?
That's right. Leaked them to an MP. He tried to argue it was in the interest of the state because he thought the government was misleading Parliament. Now, the judge basically told the jury, look, interest of the state means the government of the day. but the jury acquitted him anyway.
Wow.
Yeah. It just shows this historical, ongoing struggle with defining and proving harm, or this sort of fuzzy idea of public interest when it comes to official secrets. It highlights the deep-seated difficulties in prosecuting people who claim they acted for what they saw as a greater good. It's a recurring theme, really, showing the limits of these acts.
So these problems with the 1989 Act, they've been known about for ages then?
Oh, absolutely. What's fascinating is that this isn't news. The issues with the 1989 Act have been recognized, well, for nearly 2 decades. The Intelligence and Security Committee, that's the parliamentary body overseeing the intelligence agencies, they've repeatedly called for it to be reformed.
For 20 years.
Almost. And get this, even the agencies themselves have apparently described it as dusty and ineffective for tackling modern threats. So this isn't just about one case collapsing. It suggests a really deep systemic issue. And, this long-standing recognition eventually led to attempts to modernize, which brings us to the National Security Bill of 2023.
Right, the National Security Bill, that was supposed to be the big fix, wasn't it? Pitched as a comprehensive update, aimed squarely at what the government called tomorrow's threats, supposed to significantly boost the power to investigate and prosecute foreign spies.
A major step, trying to drag the legal framework into the 21st century to deal with, sophisticated state threats. The hope was this new law would finally provide the right tools.
So what did it actually do?
Well, it brought in several key new offenses. Fundamentally, it targets actions done for a foreign power, or on their behalf, or with the intention of benefiting a foreign power. And crucially, this is a big change. It makes it a criminal offense just to be an undeclared foreign spy working in the UK.
Just being one is illegal now.
Yeah, carries up to 14 years in prison. It closes this weird loophole where, unless you actually stole documents or something specific, just being a spy wasn't necessarily a crime in itself. The bill also added clauses on protecting trade secrets, trying to shield British businesses from IP theft backed by foreign intelligence. And it beefed up measures against cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. So it's quite broad, trying to cover a lot of modern threats that the old laws just didn't really address.
And wasn't there something else, some kind of special measures? STPMs?
Ah, yes, the State Threat Prevention and Investigation Measures, STPMs. They're described as a tool of last resort, designed for those really tricky situations where a full criminal prosecution just isn't realistic, usually because the evidence is based on highly classified intelligence that you just can't use in open court.
So, a way to act without a full trial.
Essentially, yes. Their purpose is to let the Home Secretary impose targeted restrictions. Things like where someone can work, live, study, who they can talk to. It's aimed at preventing highly damaging threat activity. When you have strong intelligence pointing to a severe threat, but not enough admissible evidence for a criminal conviction that would hold up.
Sounds powerful.
It is. But it's meant to be proportionate, with checks and balances. Courts get involved, there's an independent reviewer, similar setup to terrorism prevention measures, actually. It's an attempt to find that middle ground, between doing nothing and a full prosecution, acknowledging these intelligence-led threats are different.
Okay, so the government is trying to adapt, but you mentioned this new law faced scrutiny too. It didn't fix everything.
Not quite. It raised its own concerns, and some old ones just lingered. One of the most glaring things for many experts and critics was what wasn't in the bill.
What was missing?
Direct reform of the 1989 Official Secrets Act. Despite almost everyone agreeing the 89 Act is outdated, flawed for modern threats, the new National Security Bill didn't overhaul it.
Seriously, after all that?
Yeah. The Intelligence and Security Committee, among others, were pretty disappointed. It means that fundamental damage problem, that Catch-22 we talk about, it still exists for certain types of disclosures. Feels like a missed opportunity, really, to properly modernize the whole security legal setup.
What else raised concerns?
Well, another big point of contention was initially called a gaping hole in the bill, the Foreign Agent Registration Scheme, or FARS.
Making foreign lobbyists register?
Exactly. Security experts and committees had really pushed for this. It was seen as vital to counter foreign influence by making covert lobbying transparent. Now, it was eventually added as a government amendment while the bill was going through Parliament, but critics worried about how late it came in, whether it got enough scrutiny. Some felt it wasn't fully baked initially. The idea is simple enough. Compel people lobbying or acting for hostile states or their proxies to register publicly. Make influence transparent. But the delay definitely raised some eyebrows about the government's initial strategy on that front.
Okay. And there was one specific clause that caused a stir. Clause 23, the impunity question.
That's the one. Clause 23 amends the Serious Crime Act 2007. It could potentially disapply certain criminal offenses if the actions were deemed necessary for the proper exercise of any function of an intelligence service or of the armed forces.
Sounds quite broad.
It does, and that's exactly why legal experts and human rights groups heavily criticized it. They argued it seemed to grant impunity without the need to consider whether an action is reasonable.
Isn't there already something about acting reasonably?
Well, yes. Existing laws, like Section 50 of that same Serious Crime Act, already protect officials who act reasonably. And there are ministerial authorizations under the Intelligence Services Act 1994 for specific operations. So the big question became, why is this new, broader exemption needed if those safeguards exist? Does it signal a move away from needing actions to be reasonable? It sparked a huge debate about balancing effectiveness with oversight and accountability.
Right. So if the prosecution side is struggling with these laws, what about the defense? You mentioned secret evidence. That sounds like a major challenge for a fair trial.
A huge challenge, almost insurmountable, some would argue. Because the very nature of intelligence work often relies on this secret evidence, which clashes fundamentally with the principles of a fair trial, a cornerstone of our legal system.
And when we say secret evidence, what exactly does that mean in practice?
We mean material that a court uses, but which is kept hidden from one party, usually the defendant, and sometimes even the regular lawyers. It's the total opposite of open justice, where everyone sees and can challenge all the evidence. Imagine being accused of something serious, but you're not allowed to know the full story against you.
How can you defend yourself?
Exactly. The impact on a fair hearing is, well, profound. Critics argue secret evidence is unreliable because you can't test it properly. It's unfair because one side is effectively blindfolded. It's undemocratic, undermines transparency, often unnecessary maybe, and ultimately it damages the court's integrity. Your fundamental right to know the case against you, to confront your accuser, to have that equality of arms where both sides are on equal footing, it's severely compromised.
So how do they try and manage this? Special advocates?
Yes. Since 1997, we've had special advocates. These are security-cleared lawyers appointed to look at the secret evidence on behalf of defendants in certain cases. But here's the incredibly tricky part. Once they've seen the classified material, they are prohibited from discussing it with their own client.
Wait, they can't talk to the person they're representing about the secret stuff?
Nope. It's designed to protect the secrets, obviously, but it creates this huge barrier. Many, including a former special advocate, have called it an impossible position.
I can see why.
Yeah. Because they can't get meaningful instructions from their client about that specific evidence, they end up speculating about what might help the defense, rather than building a fully informed strategy based on what the client knows or wants to argue. The effectiveness of the whole system is seriously questioned. That same former special advocate flatly said, "A special advocate does not ensure a fair trial. That is absolutely impossible." It really highlights this deep tension between national security secrecy and the right to a fair hearing.
And there's another quirk in the UK system, isn't there? Something about intercept evidence, phone taps, emails.
Ah, yes. The UK is really unique among common law countries here. Since 1984, we've generally barred the use of intercepted communications, phone calls, emails, messages as evidence in legal proceedings.
So evidence that might be really crucial, you can't use it in court.
Largely, no. It means potentially vital information, stuff gathered through intercepts, which can be incredibly direct and revealing, often has to remain secret evidence, or just can't be used at all to secure a conviction in open court. It creates this clear mismatch between our sophisticated intelligence gathering, which often relies heavily on intercepts, and what's actually allowed in a courtroom.
While other countries do use it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Allies like the US, Canada, Australia, they routinely use intercept evidence. Its absence here creates a significant, often self-imposed hurdle for prosecutors trying to bring spy cases. A whole category of potentially powerful evidence is just off the table.
Which leads us to that fundamental gap you mentioned earlier between suspicion and actual proof.
Precisely. Intelligence agencies and courts operate on different logic. Agencies build this layered mosaic of data info from foreign partners, data mining, those intercepts we just talked about, expert analysis to form hypotheses, make predictions about threats.
Which is vital for national security, right?
Yeah.
Stopping things before they happen.
Absolutely critical. That mosaic lets them spot threats, see patterns, take preventative action. That's their main job. But this collection of data, while essential for them, often falls short of the rigorous proof needed in open court.
Different standards of evidence?
Totally different. Agencies might work on reasonable suspicion or balance of probabilities for their own decisions. A criminal court demands proof beyond a reasonable doubt, based on admissible evidence that can be openly challenged. And often, the agency's primary focus isn't even building a prosecutable case. It's about mitigating the threat, maybe disrupting an operation, maybe just monitoring someone. This creates that persistent gap between strong intelligence suspicions and legally admissible evidence. It explains why cases, even seemingly strong ones backed by intelligence, can just evaporate in court.
Okay, so the legal system clearly struggles with these cases, which begs the bigger question. Why are these cases even happening? What's the context? Our deep dive shows the UK government has been sounding the alarm about China's activities for a while now, hasn't it?
Increasingly so, yes. The UK's integrated review in 2021, and then the refresh in 2023, explicitly identified state threats as growing and diversifying. Russia was labeled the most acute threat, sure, but China was consistently flagged as presenting a major, long-term strategic challenge. This wasn't just a sudden thing. It's been building in official assessments.
And didn't the head of MI5 give a pretty stark warning recently?
He did. Ken McCallum, the Director General of MI5, back in October 2024. He said quite unequivocally that the UK faces its most complex threat environment ever seen.
Yeah.
He specifically named Russia, China, and Iran as the biggest state threats. And the statistic that really grabbed headlines was his mention of a 48% increase in state threat investigations in just the past year.
Nearly 50% increase.
Yeah, it's a huge jump. It signals a really serious growing problem from the intelligence community's perspective. Suggests a sustained, maybe intensifying campaign against UK interests.
And when they talk about China's strategy, they use this phrase, whole of state. What does that actually mean in practice?
It's a really key concept for understanding the UK's assessment. Intelligence sources here describe China's strategy as a whole-of-state approach. The idea is that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, effectively co-opts every state institution, company, and citizen to advance its goals.
So it's not just spies in trench coats.
Far from it. It means we're not just dealing with traditional espionage anymore. Under this model, potentially any aspect of society, academic research, business investment, critical infrastructure, technology, even cultural exchanges, could potentially be leveraged for intelligence gathering or influence operations. This huge integrated network makes it incredibly difficult for agencies to detect and counter, because the threat isn't confined to predictable channels. It could come from anywhere.
So how does this whole of state thing play out? What are the specific areas of concern?
Well, there are several interconnected strands. First, there's China's huge economic and technological ambition. The UK sees China's drive to become a dominant tech and economic superpower, potentially making other countries dependent, as the biggest long-term risk. This involves legitimate means like massive R&D investment in overseas projects.
But also,
according to MI5, espionage on an industrial scale, primarily aimed at stealing intellectual property, often via cyber attacks, to accelerate China's own technological development, basically shortcutting their own R&D. MI5 is quite explicit. China uses intelligence collection to support its commercial mercantile ambition. The lines between state security and economic competition get very blurry.
Okay, what else? Academia.
Yes, academic influence and leverage is seen as a significant area. China uses its considerable academic buying power. Think about it. Chinese students are the largest group of non-EU overseas students in UK universities. They generate huge income, nearly 600 million.
That's a lot of money. Gives them leverage.
That's the concern, that this financial reliance provides leverage. UK intelligence suggests China actively targets dual-use research stuff with both civilian and military potential for its own military benefit, and also tries to stifle academic debate on sensitive topics like Xinjiang or Tibet. Confucius Institutes, those Chinese government-funded language and culture centers often based in universities, are specifically cited as tools for this. It points to a deliberate strategy to shape narratives and acquire research.
And then there's more direct political stuff.
Yeah.
Interference.
Yes, more overt political interference and coercion. Examples cited include things like offers to supply research staff to MPs, potentially creating channels for influence or information gathering. More pointedly, back in 2014, China actually refused entry to Hong Kong for members of the UK's Foreign Affairs Committee investigating the situation there.
Blocking parliament.
Effectively, yes. And then in March 2021, Beijing sanctioned 5 British MPs and 2 members of the House of Lords, specifically because they were publicizing human rights abuses in Xinjiang. These aren't subtle moves. They're seen as direct attempts to influence, punish, and deter criticism, creating a real chilling effect.
Cyber attacks, too, you mentioned.
Definitely. Sophisticated cyber operations are seen as a prominent feature. Reports suggest considerable success in penetrating foreign government and private sector IT systems for data theft, espionage, establishing persistent access. And these cyber ops often support human intelligence efforts, too, by revealing vulnerabilities or potential targets for recruitment. GCHQ assesses there are thousands of active Chinese cyber groups, often state-sponsored, focused on critical infrastructure globally. It's seen as a constant, high-level digital threat.
And finally, the media, trying to influence public perception.
That's part of the picture, too. China has actively sought to expand its media presence internationally, including in the UK. A key example was China Global Television Network, CGTN, setting up its European HQ in London. The aim seemed to be projecting China's narrative globally.
But didn't they run into trouble?
They did. CGTN's UK license was suspended in 2021. Ofcom, the regulator, investigated and found its editorial content was effectively directed by the CCP, which breaches UK broadcasting rules about impartiality and state control. So, yes, an attempt to build media influence, but it hit regulatory hurdles here.
Okay, so that's a fairly comprehensive and frankly quite concerning picture painted by UK intelligence.
Right.
But as you said, it's crucial to acknowledge the other side. Beijing denies all this.
Consistently and vigorously. The opening of our deep dive mentioned their denials, and it's fundamental. When you're discussing these highly charged accusations, you have to state clearly. While the UK government raises these serious concerns based on its intelligence, China maintains its innocence. They refute the claims of espionage and interference, often calling them baseless or politically motivated.
And they point to the lack of public proof.
That's often a core part of their response, yes. They frequently ask, where is the evidence? They highlight that these are accusations which, as we saw with the collapse case itself, need to stand up to scrutiny and require admissible proof, particularly in a court of law. They argue these claims often lack that concrete, publicly verifiable evidence.
And it's not just simple denial, is it? Didn't the UK's own intelligence committee suggest China's actions might be tempered?
That's a really interesting nuance from the ISC report, yes. It noted that while China poses a significant state threat, its targeting of the UK is likely tempered by its need to keep the diplomatic relationship afloat in order to retain economic ties with the UK.
So they don't want to wreck the economic relationship.
Exactly. It suggests a calculated approach from Beijing, balancing their strategic ambitions and intelligence goals against the practical need to maintain those vital economic and diplomatic links. Acting too aggressively could jeopardize trade and investment, which they also value. It's a complex calculation.
But relations have cooled, haven't they? The Huawei decision.
Oh, definitely. That was a major turning point. When the UK government banned Huawei equipment from the 5G network in 2020, citing security risks, it triggered significant diplomatic backlash. China's ambassador at the time, Liu Xiaoming, publicly called it a dark day for UK-China relations. That shows how sensitive these security decisions are for Beijing. The ISC report itself spoke of a definite cooling and predicted a likely downwards trajectory in the relationship overall. So despite wanting economic ties, security actions have real consequences.
And there's this comparison often made with the U.S. approach, isn't there, that the UK isn't doing as much?
Yes, the ISC raised concerns about that too. They suggested that, unlike the United States, the UK hadn't taken similar preventative action in certain areas. The specific example they used was U.S. restrictions on some Chinese students, particularly those linked to military universities or studying sensitive subjects.
The implication being?
The implication being that without similar checks, UK institutions might become more attractive targets for individuals seeking sensitive intellectual property or expertise, simply because the barriers are lower here. It points to this perceived gap, this difference in proactive defense posture compared to a key ally like the U.S. The ISC's worry is that without equivalent, robust preventative measures, the UK could inadvertently become a softer target for the very activities its own agencies are warning about. It highlights this ongoing debate in London. How do you balance openness, economic engagement, academic exchange with these growing security concerns? The US seems to have taken a harder line in some areas, while the UK has traditionally tried to balance more.
Which brings us right back to that core complexity, doesn't it? How does a government possibly navigate these really serious security warnings they themselves are issuing, while trying to keep vital international relationships going and making sure their own legal system can actually handle it when they try to prosecute alleged spies? It's an incredibly difficult balancing act, especially when economics and security are so tangled up.
So given this tangled web, the legal problems, the escalating threats, it's really clear that this collapsed spy case isn't just some random event, is it? It forces a much bigger rethink about how the UK protects itself, especially right inside Parliament, where these individuals allegedly operated. It really makes you look hard at the country's security setup.
Absolutely. And the government has been trying to evolve its response. There's been quite a bit of legislative activity beyond just the National Security Bill. For example, the Economic Crime Act, which came in fast in 2022, largely spurred by the invasion of Ukraine. But its impact is broader.
What did that one do again?
It introduced that public register of who actually owns overseas entities holding UK property, trying to make it harder to hide dirty money. It also strengthened things like unexplained wealth orders, tools to seize assets, and broadened the scope for sanctions. The whole aim was tackling illicit finance and the influence that can come with it, making the UK less attractive for hiding corrupt wealth.
A move towards transparency, then.
Definitely. And then you also had the Online Safety Act in 2023, another significant piece of legislation. It specifically makes foreign interference, using the definition from the National Security Act, a priority offense.
Meaning what for tech companies?
It means social media platforms, search engines, they now have a legal duty to take proactive steps to find and minimize people's exposure to state-sponsored disinformation. Stuff aimed at messing with UK democracy or security. It's a direct shot at tackling online information warfare, putting the onus on the platforms themselves.
And what about visas? Immigration, have there been changes there?
Yes, quite a few reforms aimed at closing perceived security loopholes. That Tier 1 investor visa, the golden visa for wealthy individuals, that was finally scrapped in 2022. There were just too many long-standing concerns about it being misused, potentially allowing illicit wealth into the UK with insufficient checks. An internal review even found a small minority of high-risk cases linked to it.
So, closing that door. Anything else?
They've also expanded powers to exclude people from the UK. In early 2025, the policy was updated to specifically target elites with links to the Russian state. Plus, restrictions were put on Russian diplomatic visas limiting their stay, their activities. And broader powers came in back in 2022, allowing visa penalties for citizens from countries deemed risky to international peace, though they haven't been formally used against Russia or Belarus yet. But reports suggest visa applications from those countries are already facing much slower processing due to extra security checks. So a definite tightening up.
And is there coordination across government? It sounds like lots of different departments are involved.
There's an effort towards that, yes. The Defending Democracy Task Force was set up for exactly that reason. It's meant to work across government departments, with Parliament, the intelligence agencies, devolved governments, local councils, even the private sector and civil society. The goal is to address the full range of threats to democratic institutions in a joined-up way, recognizing it's not just one department's problem.
What about protecting actual physical things, critical infrastructure?
That's a huge focus too, and increasingly urgent. Undersea infrastructure, those vital data cables carrying nearly all global communications and finance, is a major concern, especially regarding potential Russian activity, intelligence gathering, even sabotage threats. The Defense Secretary stated very clearly in January 2025 that the UK is strengthening our response to stop Russian ships and aircraft operating sneakily near UK or NATO territory, recognizing just how vulnerable those cables are.
And Parliament is looking into this specifically.
Yes. The Joint Committee on National Security Strategy launched a specific inquiry into undersea cables in January 2025. They're examining the UK's ability to actually defend this vital infrastructure and how resilient it is if it is disrupted. A disruption could be catastrophic, economically and societally. It shows how high up the agenda this has climbed.
And the nuclear sector. You mentioned concerns there earlier regarding China.
Yes, the civil nuclear sector is seen as particularly vulnerable. Past investments by CGN, that's China General Nuclear Power Group, a state-owned firm in the Hinkley Point C project, opened the door, according to critics. And the prospect of CGN potentially building and running the Bradwell B reactor raised even more alarms. The fear is it would create a direct channel from the UK nuclear enterprise to the Chinese state.
Raising risks of espionage.
Exactly. Serious concerns about the incentive and opportunity for espionage, including physical access to sensitive sites, technology transfer risks, and just the huge vulnerability that comes from potentially having another state controlling part of your critical energy supply.
Yeah.
The U.S. even publicly warned the U.K. against dealing further with CGN, highlighting the international security dimension.
So lots of moving parts, lots of efforts to strengthen defenses, but it leads back to that question, who's watching the watchers? Is the oversight keeping pace with all these complex threats?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And historically, there have been issues. For a while, there was what's been called an intelligence gap, specifically regarding China. It seems that until relatively recently, the UK intelligence agencies didn't fully see countering Chinese interference in the UK as their direct responsibility. They thought maybe policy departments should handle it, or they were focused elsewhere.
So things just fell through the cracks.
That's the description used, yeah. These activities fell through the cracks because the specific responsibility wasn't clearly assigned, which, looking back, had been described as a serious failure to protect UK interests from what was clearly a growing challenge. It really shows how a whole-of-state adversary can exploit those kinds of internal silos.
But that's changed now. Agencies have widened their focus.
It appears so. There's been a clear shift. MI5 has explicitly widened the aperture. They now recognize that, quote, Chinese investments in our economy are as much of a threat as intellectual property stolen across a cyber domain or by a spy. So they're actively working to defend economic resilience now, seeing it as a core security issue. GCHQ and the National Cybersecurity Center are also ramping up efforts on China-related cyber threats. So yes, while there was a gap, they're adapting their mandates.
But even with that shift, are there still concerns about oversight, particularly around things like foreign investment?
Concerns definitely persist. Critics, including parliamentary committees, argue the government still shies away from meaningful scrutiny of really sensitive investment deals. They point to things like the initial Huawei decision-making process or the government's own investment in the satellite company OneWeb. The Intelligence and Security Committee, the ISC, actually argued the government deliberately chose not to give the ISC oversight powers for sensitive investment deals, leaving a potential blind spot.
And what about overseeing the new laws themselves, like the Telecom Security Act dealing with Huawei?
That's another area highlighted as lacking adequate oversight. That act allows designation of high-risk vendors like Huawei and sets security rules for networks. But crucially, it doesn't include a mechanism for proper parliamentary oversight of how those vendor decisions are made. The ISC, who first raised the Huawei concerns, recommended that sensitive info justifying these decisions should be shared with them confidentially. That way, Parliament gets notified and can scrutinize without risking national security. But the government rejected that proposal.
Raises questions about transparency, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Questions about transparency and accountability in really high-stakes national security decisions.
And what about resources? Do the agencies have enough funding and staff to actually counter this whole-of-state approach effectively?
That's another recurring criticism from the ISC. They've described the level of resource dedicated to countering China's comprehensive strategy as completely inadequate. They pointed out, for example, that a funding increase announced in 2020 was only guaranteed for 1 year, which makes long-term strategic planning against a persistent threat really difficult.
Hard to plan long-term on short-term funding.
Exactly. And furthermore, partly due to pandemic pressures, the Cabinet Office apparently hadn't properly measured how well the agencies were actually performing against their specific requirements regarding China. This left Parliament, according to the ISC, without clear assurance about whether the response was actually effective. So it's not just about funding levels, but also about ensuring accountability and measuring success against such a complex threat.
And a foreign agent register we talked about earlier, that lack of a comprehensive scheme is still seen as a major vulnerability.
A huge one, yes. That absence of a proper, comprehensive foreign agent or foreign influence registration scheme keeps coming up in parliamentary reports and debates. It's seen as absolutely critical to tackle undue influence and close these loopholes that let money and influence from potentially hostile states seep into the UK system through academia, think tanks, business, culture, media, often via individuals who aren't traditional lobbyists. The fact it was added late to the National Security Bill and the criticism around that just underscores how significant this gap is perceived to be by many in Parliament.
So it really becomes clear that the tools, the laws, the oversight mechanisms, they all need constant ongoing adaptation to keep up with these dynamic threats. Even with the recent changes, there are still significant gaps and areas needing improvement, as highlighted by this case collapsing and the ongoing parliamentary scrutiny. This whole deep dive, it really shows that the sudden collapse of a big espionage case like this, it's far from just being some weird anomaly. It feels more like a symptom, doesn't it? A symptom of these deeper systemic challenges where national security, the law, and shifting geopolitics all collide. We've definitely seen how incredibly difficult it is to turn intelligence suspicions, however strong, into evidence that works in court, especially with the current laws.
That damage dilemma in the Official Secrets Act, the restrictions on using secret evidence, the UK's unique ban on intercept evidence, they create these massive hurdles for prosecutors.
Yeah.
Even when agencies like MI5 are convinced there's a real threat.
And we've heard the UK government's consistent warnings about the threat from China, economic spying, influencing universities, cyber attacks, political pressure, that whole of state approach you described. That's the picture painted by UK intelligence.
Yeah, that's the assessment from MI5 and GCHQ, a pervasive, challenging adversary. But equally, we have to remember the other side. The diplomatic needs, the economic ties, and Beijing's constant denials. They consistently question the accusations, point to the need for actual public proof, not just intelligence claims. And this dynamic makes the UK's response incredibly delicate. When cases collapse because the proof isn't there for court, it puts the government in a really tough spot.
And right inside Parliament, these drop charges are clearly forcing a rethink. Maybe a belated one, but a necessary one. About security protocols, about counter-espionage strategies. We're seeing new laws like the National Security Act, the Online Safety Act. We're hearing these loud calls for better oversight, for that foreign agent register. That historical intelligence gap on China seems to be closing. Agencies are broadening their focus to protect the economy, critical infrastructure.
Yeah, they're trying to adapt. But that core mystery, how does a case this serious, built by counterterrorism police, just vanish? It says so much about that permanent tension, doesn't it? Between the secret world of intelligence gathering, the public demands of the legal system for admissible proof, and that vital principle of open justice. It just underscores the struggle all democracies face, really. How do you protect national security from these complex, hidden state threats while still upholding the democratic values you're trying to defend? Values like transparency, accountability, fair trials for everyone.
So ultimately, the story of this collapsed spy case, it isn't just about two men walking free or government feeling frustrated. It's a really stark illustration of that intricate, ongoing dance between hidden threats, which are getting ever more sophisticated, and the very visible, enduring need for accountability. And for a legal system that can somehow grapple with both, that can keep adapting to this constantly changing global landscape of spying and influence.